Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone here in-house to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off. It is always appreciated. We will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. And, of course, our Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion and introducing our special guest is Dr. Niall Gardner. Dr. Gardner is director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom and a former aide to Lady Thatcher. He has worked at the heart of Washington policy for over a decade and is a leading expert on the U.S.-UK special relationship. Dr. Gardner is a regular contributor to the London Daily Telegraph and appears frequently on American and British television in commentary roles. He received his doctorate in history from Yale University. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Niall Gardner. Niall?
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. It is my pleasure to introduce our good friend, Con Coughlin, the defense editor of the Daily Telegraph and a world-renowned expert on the Middle East. Con is the critically acclaimed author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller, Saddam, His Rise and Fall. He appears regularly on television and radio in the United States and Great Britain and has been a frequent political commentator on Fox News, CNN, and NBC, as well as the BBC and Sky News. Con is a veteran foreign correspondent, and his latest book gives a gripping account of Sir Winston Churchill's first military campaign as a young cavalry lieutenant fighting a frontier war against Pashtun tribesmen on the northwest frontier, the great-great-grandfathers of the Taliban and tribal insurgents in modern-day Afghanistan. As Con writes, this is a story of high adventure and imperial endeavor, which contains important lessons and warnings for today. It is fitting that our event on Churchill is hosted by the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Throughout her political career, Lady Thatcher drew strength and inspiration from Churchill's leadership, especially at moments when she faced huge challenges, key moments in history that called for ironclad resolve. She also drew comfort from the fact that Churchill had on numerous occasions found himself alone on the political stage, scorned even by many in his own party, but nevertheless determined to stand by his principles and beliefs. Thatcher's determination to confront tyrannical regimes and reject the temptations of appeasement was influenced by her admiration for Churchill's courage. To quote the Iron Lady, everything about Churchill was heroic. He was a leader, a man among men. And as she recalled in a speech at Blenheim Palace, Churchill's birthplace, for me and for so many others, our ideas of liberty, of honour, of sacrifice, of fellowship, of valour, our idea of Britain herself, have been formed by Churchill's words. Please join me in welcoming Con Coughlin, historian, journalist, and staunch Thatcherite. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very warm introduction, Niall. It's a great pleasure to be back here at Heritage. The book, Churchill's First War, is a story about what I think is the making of Winston Churchill. When Niall talks about courage, his ability to prevail in adversity, this fascinating but neglected period in Churchill's early life almost lays the foundations for the man Churchill became in later life. And when I approached this subject, I think probably like most people, when I thought of young Winston, I thought of Carl Foreman's film, and I thought of his exploits during the Boer War, his escape from captivity, and all that. And in fact, when I was started research, I had another look at Carl Foreman's film, and the only reference really to Churchill in Afghanistan is the opening sequence, where you have a picture of young Winston on a grey horse, and the general is saying to one of his young officers, "Who's that bloody fool on the grey?" "Someone who wants to get noticed, I suppose," says the young officer. "He'll get noticed. He'll get his bloody head blown off." And indeed, the reason young Winston went up to the northwest frontier of the British Empire, an area that is today forms part of Pakistan, is he did want to get himself noticed. He was 22 years old. His family background was in some disarray. His father, Lord Randolph, had died of syphilis when Churchill was still studying at Sandhurst. His mother, Jenny Churchill, a great society beauty, had a reputation as something of a grande horizontale for her various dalliances with society gentlemen. Among her admirers was the then Prince of Wales, Bertie, and the family had a rather difficult reputation in British society. And not only that, they were deeply impoverished. And at the time that Lord Randolph died in 1895, young Winston was just coming out of Sandhurst, having had a very indifferent schooling at one of Britain's leading public schools, Harrow. And in those days, if you weren't very bright, if you weren't being singled out for a career in the law or to go to university or something useful, you went into the army class. And that's where young Winston languished for most of his days at Harrow. And he was so behind academically that it took him 3 attempts to get into Sandhurst. He failed the first 2 attempts, and he had to be sent to what we call a crammer to get him through the exam. So young Churchill's fortunes were at a very low ebb indeed when he embarked on life. But he made it very clear from a very early age that having decided on a military career, and unlike a lot of politicians today, he thought a military career was the perfect foundation for a life in politics. And from a very early age, he had this vision of himself going to the remote corners of the British Empire, winning medals, winning acclaim, and then using that acclaim to launch his political career. Because even at this stage, when he was training at Sandhurst, on his days off, he would go to the House of Commons and hear the great parliamentarians of the day speak. He read avidly up on his late father's speeches. And in one of his wonderful phrases, he said, and they say this is at the age of 22, he said that he wanted to beat his medals into an iron dispatch box. So the young Winston was a very precocious character, and very, very keen to get out to places like the Afghan border and make a name for himself. And in fact, one of his more memorable quotes from this period that he wrote in his own account of his war in Afghanistan, the Malakand Field Force, and it just sort of captures the joie de vivre of Churchill going off to battle as a young soldier. He writes, "Nothing in life is so exhilarating as to be shot at without result." So it was really very much with this gung-ho attitude that young Winston set off for the northwest frontier. And he had the other thing that was driving him was that he needed somehow to make money. And one of the more sort of enterprising arrangements that had been hit upon in the late 19th century was that British newspapers had hit on this idea that rather than send foreign correspondents off to remote parts of the world at great expense, why not get a bright young military officer to write dispatches from the front line? They probably had a good idea of what they were writing about, and secondly, if anything happened to them, then the military would have to take care of all the costs rather than newspapers. So, and in that spirit, Churchill got himself an arrangement with my newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. And in fact, it was thanks to Winston Churchill and the articles he wrote during that period that this rather cosy arrangement ended, because Lord Kitchener, the then head of the British Army, took such a dim view of the witterings of a young subaltern, and openly criticising the high policy of the British military, that Lord Kitchener personally ordered that the practice cease, and it's never been undertaken since, except by retired officers. The parallels with today, I think a lot of people in this room, when I say that Churchill was fighting the great-great-grandfathers of the Taliban, would raise an eyebrow. Not least because Churchill was fighting on the other side of the border. He was fighting in what is now modern Pakistan. But if I tell you that, and when I've travelled extensively around this region, researching the book, if I tell you that if you've got a map from the CIA of all the drone strikes that they've launched in the tribal areas of Pakistan, they correlate almost directly to the villages, tribes, and valleys where Churchill fought in 1897. The story of the young Pakistani schoolgirl, Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by the Taliban 3 years ago for campaigning for girls to go to school. She was shot in a village just a few miles away from Malakand, where Churchill was based. So in terms of history repeating itself, it's hard to have a more sort of graphic illustration of how history is repeating itself. Back in the 1890s, the main problem, and again, as I go through the Churchill story, you'll see the overlap with today. But the main problem in the 1890s for the British had been caused by the implementation, the arbitrary implementation of the Durand Line. Now, for those of you who follow the subject, the Durand Line today is the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And back in the 1890s, the British, who'd had two disastrous military campaigns in Afghanistan in the 1830s and the 1880s, had basically said, we've had enough of these Afghans, we're going to draw a border up in the Hindu Kush, and the Afghans can stay on their side of the border, and we will have the British Empire on the other, and never the two shall meet. And a bit like the security zone that the Israelis established in the West Bank, the Durand Line went right the way through tribal lands and inflamed the tribes. And then as now, Wahhabi-trained mullahs wandered around the mountains and incited the Afghan tribesmen, the Pashtun tribesmen, to revolt against the British, using very similar arguments that are used today, that these infidels were coming to usurp their religion, interfere with their customs, and take over their lives. So it wasn't very difficult, really, for the mullahs to incite the tribes. And Winston Churchill, even though he only spent 6 weeks up there, and to my mind never actually met an Afghan, he became a self-appointed expert on these people. And in Churchill's day, they were known as the Taliban Ulans. And he wrote in one of his dispatches, one of his early dispatches for the Daily Telegraph, of the very low opinion he had of these Talibs. He viewed them as degraded a race as any on the fringe of humanity, fierce as a tiger, but less cleanly, as dangerous, but not so graceful. He blamed the Talibs for the Afghans' lamentable absence of civilized development, keeping them in what he called the grip of miserable superstition. Churchill was also particularly repelled by the Talibs' loose moral conduct. They lived free at the expense of the people, he wrote, and more than this, they enjoy a sort of droit de seigneur, and no man's wife or daughter is safe from them. Of some of their manners and morals, it is impossible to write. Well, you can imagine the impact that had on the breakfast tables in London when the Daily Telegraph dropped through the letterbox in the 1890s. As a result of the Durand Line being established, the tribes were very quickly in a stage of revolt and came charging down from the Afghan mountains and attacked the British bases. First of all at Chitral in 1895, where there was a very bitter contest, and later on all along the border, Waziristan, all the places we know so well today, all these areas, the Moman Valley where Churchill fought, they all took up arms against the British at different stages. And after the Chitral uprising, the British government, under now a Conservative Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, decided that they needed to put up some defences around the border to protect their garrisons from future attack. One of these bases was a place called Abbottabad, which I think we all know from what happened to Mr. bin Laden a couple of years ago. Abbottabad, in fact, was the main one of the main supply bases for the forts, the network of forts built along the frontier. And one of these forts was built at Malakand. And in 1897, 2 years after Chitral, while the fort was being built, again, the mullahs were very successful in inciting the tribesmen that this fort was just the first step towards a British takeover of their region, and a great uprising started in the summer of 1897. Now, at this time, Churchill was kicking his heels in London. He joined a very smart regiment, the Queen's 4th Own Hussars, which had taken part in the charge of the Light Brigade and had fought with Wellington during the Peninsular Wars. It was a very smart regiment, and of course the reason he joined a smart regiment was that it went to the best parties and it meant he would get noticed. But much to his frustration, this smart regiment, when it was being deployed to India, was not going up to the north where all the trouble was, but down to the south. And you get this wonderful sense of the sort of impertinence and impatience of the young Winston Churchill, as he got his mother, who I said had very high social connections, and everybody else he could think of to try and get him posted somewhere more interesting and exciting, where he was more likely to win medals. When I was researching the book, I looked at some of the British regimental records from this period, and quite a few young British officers perished during their tours of duty in southern India, but none of them died in combat. They all died in pursuits such as pig sticking and tiger hunting and things like that. And young Churchill was in no mood to waste his life chasing wild beasts. He wanted action. And although he did have to join his garrison in southern India, before he left, he ran into a veteran of frontier warfare, a splendidly named British general called General Sir Bindon Blood. And General Blood had fought in several campaigns on the frontier with some distinction. And young Churchill had met him at a party in London and basically extracted this promise from Blood that if there was any more trouble, he would send for Churchill and get Churchill to see some action. And sure enough, Churchill was on holiday in Britain, attending the races at Goodwood, when he read in the paper that the tribes were revolting again. They were at Malakand, and surprise, surprise, General Sir Bindon Blood had been appointed to lead the punitive expedition to subdue the tribesmen. So Churchill literally left the races at Goodwood, got a train to Victoria, got a train from Victoria down to southern Italy to get the boats back to India, pausing merely to send Blood a cable reminding him of his promise. Of course, in those days, the journey took about 3 weeks, and you get this wonderful sense of urgency with Churchill in his letters and diaries as he stops off at all the different ports along the route and goes to the telegram office, expecting to hear a reply from General Blood, and there's nothing. And he gets all the way back to southern India and still hears nothing. And by this time, he's very agitated, and he writes to his mother in terms that, this fellow Blood is a bit of a cad. I mean, how dare he not reply to me, a Churchill at that? Eventually, Blood, who of course was off campaigning, and quite hard campaigning it was too, when he did get back from the first phase of the campaign against the tribes, he did send a cable to Churchill saying, well, we don't have any room on the military staff, but why don't you come up as a newspaper correspondent? So Churchill went charging up to the northern India. It took him 5 days by train. And again, reading through the diaries, his sense of that fate was against him, that by the time he got up there on this horrible train journey through the Indian plains, all the action would be over and there'd be nothing for him to do, no medals to win. In fact, when he got to Malakand in early September 1897, the British had already suffered quite heavy casualties, and they were looking for young officers to replace those who had been killed. And in those days, rather than send the effects of injured soldiers home, they simply had an auction so that their comrades in arms could benefit from their loss. So Churchill went straight to one of these auctions to get himself his fighting kit, basically, his cavalry kit. And among the effects being sold was a grey horse, a white horse. And Churchill thought, well, I'll have that because I will get myself noticed, not realising the reason the horse was up for sale in the first place was that the sharpshooters in the Hindu Kush had taken one very good shot at the occupant. Churchill gets to Malakand with all his kit and his white horse, desperate for action. Again, he's frustrated because everybody's off on yet another mission. And he goes to the mess bar at Malakand and he asks if there is any drink available, and he's told there's only whiskey and soda, sir. He said, well, Churchills don't drink whiskey and soda. That's a very inferior drink. We like brandy. And he said, well, I'm terribly sorry. That's all we've got. Lump it or leave it. He said, well, I'll try it. And it was from that day that Churchill's long association with whiskey and soda can be traced. Blood comes back, finds Churchill loitering around and thinks, well, we've got to make use of you. You can write some dispatches, but we need you to do some of the sharp-end stuff. And so Churchill is sent to the Mohman Valley. Again, if you Google the Mohman Valley, you'll see that it's been the subject of several drone strikes in recent years as the Taliban have moved from the Afghan border into Pakistan and launched their bid against the Pakistani government. So all these tribes are so interlinked. And Churchill was sent to the Mohman Valley. The Mohman Valley, most of the tribes in the Mohman Valley had participated in the revolt against Malakand. And so the British tactics then were to go to the different villages and either parley with them, get the tribes to sign orders of good behaviour. Otherwise, they were punished. The crops were burnt, the houses were burnt, and the men taken into captivity, or even worse. It was a pretty hard-edged operation. And Churchill, one of Churchill's first engagements on the 16th of September 1897 took place at a village called Shahi Tangi, again, the subject of several drone strikes in recent years. And this actually was one of the many occasions during the 6-week period where Churchill came within a whisker of losing his life. He later told his mother he came under fire 10 complete times, he boasted. And on 3 of these occasions, he came very close to being killed. And the moment at Shahi Tangi, as I said, was probably one of the most dangerous moments of his early career as a soldier. Basically, the party went up a spur to a hillside to punish a village, Shahi Tangi. And because it was a long climb, Churchill had to dismount his horse, so he wasn't as conspicuous as he might have been. And they had a 3-hour climb up to the village. They got there, and as was the custom, the villagers had all disappeared. And as they do now, they watched the Western forces approach, looked for any weaknesses in their positions, and then looked to see if there was some way to attack, to ambush in some shape or form. I mean, again, American, British, French soldiers fighting in Afghanistan have experienced very similar tactics from the Taliban. On this particular day, the British have made the mistake of going well beyond the cover provided by the mountain batteries. And when they got to Shahi Tanji, one of the senior officers looked around and said, well, we're rather in the air here, aren't we? And the fact the village was deserted did not lead them to believe that nobody was around. And sure enough, as they started to withdraw, hundreds of tribesmen came pouring down from the surrounding hills and started to attack Churchill's party, which in total was about 90 strong. Churchill was deputed to take part, to provide covering fire while the main party withdrew, which they did in stages. And the first stage was effected without too much incident. But by the time they started to move to undertake the second part of withdrawal, the tribesmen had really closed in. And Churchill has a really gripping account of just how intense the fighting was at this particular stage. Once the main body had moved down to a position, Churchill's covering party then got up to follow them. The rest of our party got up and turned to retreat. There was a ragged volley from the rocks, shouts, exclamations, and a scream. I thought for a moment that 5 or 6 of our men had laid down again. So they had. 2 killed and 3 wounded. 1 man shot through the breast and pouring with blood. Another lay on his back, kicking and twisting. The British officer was spinning around just behind me, his face a mass of blood, his right eye cut out. Yes, it was certainly an adventure. So Churchill, as part of a group of 10, then has to try and recover the bodies, get the wounded down, and in fact he got a mention in dispatches for this particular, for his bravery in this action. And in fact, later on, being Churchill, he complained to his friends that, you know, if a senior officer had been around and if he'd been on his grey, then somebody would have noticed him and given him the Victoria Cross, because Victoria Crosses were given out in this campaign. And one of Churchill's great rivals from this period, Viscount Fincastle, who wrote dispatches for the Times newspaper, rather inferior organ in my view, but Fincastle managed to win the Victoria Cross, and that really irritated Churchill, that all he got was a mention in dispatches. But the really interesting thing about this lesson from Churchill's First War is that he learnt firsthand what conflict was really like, what it was like to fight, what it was like to be in an engagement where at one point, when he ran out of bullets, he and the tribesmen were throwing rocks at each other. I mean, that's how close the fighting was. And of course, a lot of Churchill's friends were killed during this campaign. And some of them are buried up in Malakand today, a rather sort of forgotten part of the world. And of course, Churchill himself could very easily have perished and would probably have been laid to rest up there. And the history of the 20th century may have been very different. But again, Churchill was a very complex person when it came to his wartime leadership. And I think people forget the humanity of Churchill as a wartime leader. One of the big arguments he kept putting up about in his opposition to the D-Day landings was his terrible fear about the loss of life. And again, coming back to Malakand, Churchill was in another engagement a couple of weeks after the Shahi Tanji event, was involved in another really bitter skirmish when a very close friend of his, another young lieutenant by the name of Brown Wilkinson, was shot and killed right by Churchill's side. And Churchill had to help retrieve the body so that it wasn't cut up by the Afghans. And he later wrote to his mother, "I very rarely detect genuine emotion in myself, but I must rank as a rare instance the fact that I cried when I met the Royal West Kents on the 30th of September and saw the men really unsteady under fire and tired of the game, and that poor young officer literally cut to pieces on a stretcher. So you have Churchill really understanding the nature of war, and that young man who has started out writing about the exhilaration of being shot at is learning a very fast and bitter lesson on the realities of war. But Churchill did survive, and this, when you look back on it, and as I say, this is a very fascinating and neglected bit of Churchillian history, because it was the making of Winston Churchill for several reasons. As I said, he went out there with one purpose, to make a name for himself and to lay the platform for his later career as a politician. And he achieved that in spades. First of all, of course, he got his mention in dispatches. He also wrote a series of rather fine newspaper articles. I must say, I'm a former foreign editor at the Telegraph, and I've seen some good dispatches in my time, but I must say, anything coming from Winston Churchill would have been warmly received. And as a result of his dispatches, he was very frustrated. His one regret about the newspaper aspect of things was that the Telegraph didn't print his name on them. They were just by a young officer. And in fact, the intemperance of his language to his mother when he discovers that these scoundrels at the Daily Telegraph didn't give him a byline. And he thinks, well, the only way around that is to write a book. And I will tell the great British public and the greater world of just how brave I am and how wonderful I've been and how important I've been to the success of this campaign. And so he set down to write the story of the Malakand Field Force, which was Churchill's first literary offering. And you can imagine his immense irritation when he also discovered his great rival Viscount Fincastle had much the same idea. And the two young officers were in this bitter race to get their books out. They were both published in the spring of 1898. And I must say Churchill's is a far better read. It's quite florid. Of course, when you check with the regimental archives and other papers from the period, it's all very pro-Churchill. But it's quite a good read for that. And as a result of the book, Churchill received a warm letter from the Prince of Wales, who'd been given a copy of the tome by Jenny Churchill. But probably more importantly, Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister of the day, who'd played his own role in ruining Lord Randolph's career, invited Churchill to Downing Street. So for the first time in Churchill's life, as a direct result of his exploits on the Afghan border, he's invited into Downing Street and walked into the room from where many, many decades later he really would find true fame and glory. And again, Churchill, 23 by this time, full of impertinence, having had his 6 weeks on the northwest frontier, he's desperate to get off to the Sudan, where Lord Kitchener is preparing an army for the final push against the Mahdi. And Lord Kitchener, as I said, had taken a rather dim view of this young subaltern's criticism of Blood's campaign and had no desire to have him anywhere near his army. So you can imagine Kitchener's surprise when, at the Battle of Omdurman, he looks round to find Second Lieutenant W.S. Churchill riding alongside him. And this is all as a result of a promise he got from Lord Salisbury when, as he left Downing Street after his audience, the Prime Minister said, well, if there's anything I can do for you in future, young Churchill, let me know. And quick as a flash, he said, well, yes, sir, I'd quite like to go to the Sudan. Can you arrange that for me? So Churchill's whole road to fame and glory, his participation in one of the last great cavalry charges undertaken by the British Army in the Sudan, his movement then on to cover the South African War as a foreign correspondent, his capture, his international acclaim, and of course, as a result, his election to Parliament soon after his return. He'd become so famous in Britain that at the music halls they used to sing a little refrain. You've heard of Winston Churchill. This is all I have to say. He's the latest and the greatest correspondent of the day. That was the 1890s. Today, I think, when we look at Afghanistan, and this year, of course, is a rather crucial year for the American-led campaign that we've had there for 10 years, I think people will reflect on some of the lessons Churchill and the British learnt in the 1890s. The original idea for writing this book came from a conversation I had with General David Petraeus when he was the NATO commander, and he was drawing up his counterinsurgency strategy for defeating the Taliban. And he'd been rereading Churchill's Malakand Field Force and the lessons of the British. And Petraeus tells me in an interview with the book that, you know, just like the British, you can put in all the military resources that you have at your disposal, but there's not a military solution to this problem. You have to have a political solution, and I think that's quite a challenge in the years coming forward, in the months ahead. But Churchill's own conclusion, having gone into this conflict in a very gung-ho manner, was rather terse. Financially, it is ruinous. Morally, it is wicked. Militarily, it is an open question. And politically, it is a blunder. And I think those words will occupy many of our thoughts in the months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Con, for a tremendous talk. We now have some time for questions. Would like to invite questions from the audience. Please do identify yourself first, and any institutional affiliation as well. The gentleman over there in the red tie.
Yeah, please.
Eric Rosenman from the Washington Office of CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America. When it's said, as you just did, that there is no political, no military solution to conflicts like this, doesn't it really mean that there's no political solution without first an advantageous military accomplishment?
Well, that would be my view. I mean, I'm the defence editor at my newspaper, and so I spend a lot of time with the military, and I've covered most of the campaigns of the last couple of decades. And I think, yes, I mean, one of the controversies about the Afghan campaign is that under Generals Petraeus and McChrystal, an overall strategy was devised whereby military pressure would be applied against the enemy. And by the time Petraeus and McChrystal appeared on the scene, we had basically an industrial strength insurgency on our hands. But they made it very clear that the military effort was only a means to an end, and the end was some kind of political resolution. But the moment President Obama said that he wanted to withdraw the forces and not see the job through, the ability of the West to secure that kind of political settlement, I think, has been in doubt. And you know, an office was opened in Qatar to facilitate peace talks between the Afghans and the Taliban, and it's remained empty for as long as it's been there. And I think there is a big problem here. Whatever you think of the Iraq conflict, the military pressure eventually led to a political settlement. It might not be a perfect political settlement, but the Iraqi government is democratically elected, and they have a new constitution based on democracy and the rule of law, which they wouldn't have had it not been for the original military effort.
Gentleman here.
Yes, my name is Daniel Kelly. My name is Dan Kelly, no institutional affiliations. Isn't one problem, though, if you don't set a deadline, such as President Obama has, that there would be incentive among the local political officials not to change their behavior? For example, I think Melvin Laird, who was Secretary of Defense under President Nixon, said one of the problems in Vietnam was that by withdrawing, we change the incentives so that the Vietnamese government would be willing to take on more of the fighting responsibilities?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the shadow of Vietnam was one that was very much in the president's mind when he said he wanted to set a deadline. But I mean, the counter to that is that, you know, if at D-Day we'd said, right, you know, we'll invade France and Germany, but we'll to stop fighting in the spring of 1945, I think we'd have had a far more difficult fight and a far more difficult challenge in trying to win that war. The deadline is fine, so long as the parameters are clearly set of what are to be achieved. But this deadline is just about combat operations. And the way things are going now, I can see after more than a decade of effort, we will withdraw from Afghanistan. The Taliban will be back in control with all the implications that has for our security, and we will have no influence over those outcomes.
Con, we know that David Cameron has read your book. In fact, there were pictures in the Telegraph of Cameron on the beach reading your book last summer. Less likely that President Obama's read your book, unfortunately, but although he should read it and learn from it. What's your overall assessment of Obama's handling of the war in Afghanistan?
Well, I think it's been rather confused. I mean, he came in, if you remember, the first sort of 9 months of his presidency. He had a very thorough review of the Afghan program. And as a result of that, signed up to the counterinsurgency strategy devised by General Petraeus and General McChrystal and the American Army. But within months of having signed up to that, he changed his mind. And it's, you know, one of the... This is where I find it rather difficult. I mean, if his heart wasn't in the Afghan mission at the start, then why sign up to the counterinsurgency strategy? And as I say, my concern now is, you know, what is going to happen when combat operations are wound down by the end of this year? And I can foresee a lot of trouble ahead.
David Azarad with the Heritage Foundation. You got chuckles from the audience when you said that when you compare what he wrote in his book to the records, it's more pro-Churchill than it. I don't forget how you phrased it exactly. I don't remember how you phrased it exactly. Could you give us a better sense of how he wrote his history and how it differs from what actually happened?
Well, for example, in some of his, I mean, it was very entertaining going through his early articles for the Daily Telegraph, because he wrote a lot of them before he even got to the front, which, you know, I think we call them byline bandits in Fleet Street. And he clearly read up a lot on what was going on. But he gives this wonderful first-person account of the battle at the Malakand Fort, when he was actually on a boat somewhere sort of bobbing around the Mediterranean. And it's that kind of flourish that he brings to his writing. And of course, when you study the other contemporary accounts, they're rather different. And one of the more amusing aspects of the narrative are some of the accounts of his fellow soldiers in encountering the 22-year-old Churchill, and the word bumptious comes up time and time again. On one occasion, his fellow officers get so fed up with him, after a mess dinner, they basically put a sofa on top of him and sit on him. And he wriggles free and says, "No one keeps a Churchill down." And there's this other wonderful account from another fellow officer on the Malakand campaign who shared a tent with Churchill. And as I said in my talk, it was a very you know, bloody campaign. And Churchill sort of lay awake, sort of looking at the stars and said, you know, I'm not worried about getting killed or injured, so long as they don't shoot me in the mouth and stop me from talking. So there's this sort of, even at this stage, you know, 22, he's very clear that he's on the road to glory and nothing's going to get in his way. And that, so again, when you look at his writing, the other sort of amusing feature of his writing is his ability to recycle, which is something he does right the way through his career. I mean, this is somebody who wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. But, you know, if he writes a newspaper article and he thinks it's good, he'll use it again and again and again. And when I was at the Churchill Archive in Cambridge, I came across the original manuscript, and he'd literally cut, you know, nice paragraphs from his telegraph dispatches onto a piece of paper, paste them onto paper, and then written around it, so he didn't have to sort of duplicate anything. Very prudent way of writing.
Tom Donlan from Barron's magazine. Could you say a bit about what happened after Churchill left Afghanistan and what lessons, if any, there are for counterinsurgency strategies in general from the British experience there, the totality of the British experience there?
Yeah. The British finally settled the border in 1901 when George Curzon, who was then the British Viceroy, literally went all the way along the border and negotiated individual tribes, deals with the tribes. Some were handed bags of gold, some were sort of carted off down to India into captivity. But the important thing, and again, researching the book, I went through the whole Malakand district and I interviewed a couple of Pakistani civil administrators who'd run the Malakand district in the 1960s, at a time, I might add, when the Queen of England went on a holiday to Malakand, and she cabled Churchill, who was then in his 90s, saying, I'm standing at the seat of, I'm visiting the seat of one of your greatest triumphs. She cabled him from Malakand. Prince Philip went duck shooting in the Swat Valley. And at this period, this is after the creation of Pakistan, the Pakistanis left the tribal areas in the same autonomous state that George Curzon had negotiated. And that arrangement really lasted until after the 9/11 attacks. And of course, one of the effects of our intervention in Afghanistan was the Taliban went over the mountains back into the tribal areas of Pakistan. And that's where all the trouble started. And Pakistanis will tell you that the only way to really calm this down, and these talks have already started, you've probably read this morning that the Pakistani government has opened talks with Taliban, i.e. the Pashtuns. I mean, nearly everybody in the Taliban movement is a Pashtun, is to try and come to this kind of arrangement again. Curzon's basic formula was, you don't threaten us and we'll leave you in peace. And if you really drill down into the offer that we're making to the Taliban is, you don't harbour terrorists who harm us and we'll leave you alone. And that's sort of, if you look at most Western policymakers, that's where they're at. The problem is, because the Taliban have nothing to fear from us anymore, they're not even willing to do that deal.
Question about
David Sadney, I'm a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan and Pakistan. I'm currently doing a lot of work with an organization called the Alliance in Support of the Afghan People, which is working to continue the U.S. commitment to Afghanistan regardless of the various political cards. We've had maybe a little success in the last few months. But I was wondering, from your perspective in the UK, is the UK involvement in Afghanistan this time, the most recent one, is it something that is going to just end, and are the British people going to wash their hands of Afghanistan now? Or do people see a future in a relationship between Afghanistan and the UK?
The answer is yes. There are elements in Britain that want to maintain a relationship. For example, Britain has just set up a military academy to train the Afghan officer corps, the Sandhurst in the Sand it's called. And that's a long-standing commitment, one where senior British officers and Sandhurst trainers go out there and train up a new generation of the Afghan army and instill in it the kind of discipline and principles that we would expect from a Western army. But whether this is sustained is a big question. I mean, as you probably know, the whole Chicago agreement of 2 years ago was that the West provided $4 million or so to pay for the Afghans. But the absence of a bilateral security pact with Karzai really jeopardizes that. Karzai has gone off on his own strange journey again. And I get the sense that the Obama administration is almost sort of exasperated by this and is just not prepared to make any commitment beyond 2014. But it's all in the balance. I mean, from my experience of working in Afghanistan as a journalist, I don't think the Afghan army and the police force is yet ready to take complete control of security. You know, they do a lot of good work at the moment, but that's because we are helping them. We provide the helicopters, the enablers, the intelligence. And without that, I can see the whole thing falling apart very quickly, just as it did after the Soviets withdrew in '89. And I covered that and saw that happen. So, you know, I've a long history of involvement in this part of the world.
Con, a final question for you regarding British defence cuts, an issue of significant debate in London at the moment. What's your view of the coalition government's handling of British defence spending? Do you think that Britain's defences have been significantly undercut through this wave of defence cuts over the last few years?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of damage inflicted to our military capabilities. Although, having said that, the British played quite a sort of lead role in the Libyan air campaign 3 years ago to get rid of Gaddafi. And knowing the British military as I do, that if something happened and they needed to turn up and do something, they would. But the cuts mean that we're in no position at the moment to undertake the kind of enduring long-term operations that we've had in the past decade in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But having said that, I do not see any politician in London willing to commit British forces in that way. I went with the British Foreign Secretary to Mali earlier this year when the whole Al-Qaeda thing blew up there. And he kept pointing out that he loved the military. He was very proud of the way Britain had handled Libya because there were no boots on the ground, no British casualties, and the job was achieved. Well, you look at Libya today, and it's hardly a triumph, is all I would say. But I just think at the moment, and the same is true here in Washington, I detect, the appetite for committing the military to open-ended operations overseas is very, very limited at the moment.
Well, Con, thank you very much for an absolutely superb
Thank you.
talk today. And thank you to everybody for joining us. We do have copies of the book available for purchase in the lobby, and Con will sign those books for you up here on the podium. But thanks everybody for coming today, and we look forward to welcoming everybody back to the Heritage Foundation scene. Thank you.